favorite Disney film was Robin Hood. I absolutely loved Robin Hood, and me and my sister would spend hours jumping out of trees and attacking each other with sticks. Robin Hood's the story of a rebel who's hunted by the authorities and becomes the leader of a group of bandits who look out for those that are neediest. And that's not a terrible description of David in this passage. He's escaped from Gath, where God had narrowly preserved his life, and he's on his own. His situation's still desperate, but in this passage, he's going to find support and help from three places. And so the first one in verse 1 and 2 is David finds popular support. He leaves Philistine territory. He crosses the valley of Elah, where he'd fought and killed Goliath. And he comes to the area surrounding a city called Adullam, where he finds a cave. And this seemingly becomes common knowledge that David's in the cave at Adullam, because his brothers and his parents hear about it, and they come and join him. And then after what's presumably a relatively short time, 400 others who are also discontented and distressed come and live in the cave with David. And my question when I was reading this passage and thinking about it in preparation was, if everybody knows where David is, why doesn't Saul just come and get him? David's got 400 men, but in chapter 13, at Saul's lowest point, when people had deserted him, he still had 600 soldiers. Surely Saul could just come and crush David and his followers. Well, there's two words in those two verses that give us the answer to that question. The first word is cave. Don't picture a hollowed out side of a hill as much as a network of tunnels, like the ones the American soldiers had so much trouble getting the Taliban out of in Afghanistan. Verse 4 and 5, you notice they call the cave a stronghold. And so it's a defensible natural structure, a complex cave. One commentator says there are caves in that area today that easily rival or exceed large hotel lobbies for space. A game of full court basketball would be no problem in some of them. So that gives you the idea this cave would have chambers and areas within it that could easily accommodate a large amount of people, and then there's networks of tunnels running from them. The second word is Adullam. If you know anything about the conflict between North and South Korea, you know there's a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, a kind of area of no man's land, which acts as a buffer between the two countries. And it's meant to be an area of peace, but of course it's the center, the focus really of any conflict between the two. And so anything that happens on one side, the other side is watching keenly. And so when South Korea erected a 100-foot flagpole to put their flag on, immediately North Korea built a 160-foot flagpole and put that on their side. And anything that happens on one side is noticed and it's seen. Adullam is right on the border of Philistine territory. If Saul turned up there with an army, even a small one, it would not go unnoticed. And so he can't go and get David without risking war. And so David is actually safer in the cave in Adullam than he was in Gath. This cave is big enough and secure enough for him and for his family and 400 others to shelter with him. And I'm not saying don't go away thinking, well, everything's better for David. He's still living in a cave. He's still on the doorstep of the Philistines, but things have improved. He's not alone anymore, and he's relatively secure. I also want you to notice in these first two verses, there are two other little but important insights. One, these verses show us that Saul's reign is not popular. Because if there are 400 people who are so frustrated and disenfranchised, they're willing to leave their homes and live in a cave, 400 people feel that they would be better off in a hole with David in charge than in their homes with Saul in charge. How many other unhappy people are there that just haven't reached that level of, I'm going to go and live in a cave now? Things aren't good in Israel under Saul. We're told there are people in debt. There are people feeling distrustful, disenfranchised. Then secondly, they show us, these two verses, that David's calling is inescapable. David is God's choice to be king. And no matter where he goes, he can't escape it. The kingship seems to be following David like a bloodhound. And so even when he goes to Gath, hoping to hide who he is, the first thing they say, verse 11, we read it earlier, is this not David, the king of the land? David wasn't the king, Saul was, but the people there have heard about him and they know that this guy is perhaps more important, the real power behind the throne, the bigger threat to us Philistines. Isn't this David, the king of the land? Now he runs from Gath to hide in a cave and he can't stop people coming to him and verse 2, becoming commander over them. It's like he can't stop being king. No matter where David goes, God is determined to prepare him for and exercise him in leading his people. A lot of people today will tell you, you've got to pursue your calling. You've got to chase down that thing that God wants you to be. You young people have got to know before you're 18 exactly what you're going to do with your life, and you need to be working towards that end, because if you don't know, well, times are wasting. The days are running out. And you're missing out on what you're meant to be. Christians never have to think like that. We believe in a God who controls all things. We believe in a God who controls all things and works all things for the good of those he loves and has called. And this is one of the most freeing things about being a follower of Jesus. You concentrate on pursuing him. You put him first. You prioritize God's revealed calling through his word, God's revealed calling on your life to know Jesus and to be like Jesus. And whatever other calling he has for you, you won't miss it. A Christian doesn't have to chase their calling, because in God's sovereignty, your calling will chase you. And so I'm saying that there's nobody here who needs to live in fear that you have missed God's plan for your life. Because the one who wrote the plan in his infinite wisdom is able to see the plan worked out through his infinite power. And if you feel that God was calling you to do something in the past and you ran from it, so did Jonah, but he still did it. And if you feel God was calling you to do something and at the time you were oblivious to it, so was the Apostle Paul. But God still made sure he was the man that he chose to bring his gospel to the world. You cannot intentionally or ignorantly frustrate God's purpose for your life. And that's a freeing thing. Charles Spurgeon famously told his ministry candidates, if you can do anything else. These are men who want to go into ministry, who come and they apply to his Bible college and ministry training program. He says, if you can do anything else, do it. If you can stay out of the ministry, stay out of it. I believe the call to ministry is a unique thing with a unique weight, but the comfort applies to everyone. If God has called you to do a specific work or job or live a specific life for him, you don't need to rush it. You don't need to force it. You can be sure that God's plan and his timing are in his hands, and you will not miss out on anything he intends for you. So there's popular support, and then verse 3 and 4, there's royal support. I read this week about George Washington's mum, who was apparently a massive pain in the neck. And when he was in the middle of fighting the Revolutionary War and battling the British, she would go around complaining to everybody that would listen to her that her son didn't look after her very well. And he's constantly in combat, and she's just moaning. He's all paying attention to all those British generals, but he's not paying attention to me. And then even when he became president, she petitioned the government of Virginia, the state of Virginia, to help her because her son wasn't looking after her properly. It's just like, what a pain. It's not always easy getting on with your parents, right? That's not why David needs to find a new home for mum and dad. It's not that he can't bear to have them in the cave any longer. He wants somewhere more comfortable, somewhere more secure, safe than a cave. And so he goes to the king of Moab for help. Is David making the same mistake again? Going to a Canaanite king for a favor. Why would he take his parents to the king of Moab? Well, there's one reason that we might forget. David has got Moabite blood in his veins. His great-grandmother was Ruth, who married Boaz, had a boy called Obed, who had a boy called Jesse, who had a boy called David. David's dad's granny was from Moab. Now, we can't know how much influence that had in David's thinking or in the king's decision, but there's no doubt David's family had links to Moab, which would have strengthened his case and his appeal to the king. And I think that should give us a much deeper and richer appreciation of the amount of good that God can bring out of a bad circumstance. I was in high school and I learned that in 1928, mold accidentally contaminated one of Alexander Fleming's Petri dishes that had an influenza virus in it. And he noticed by chance that the mold had eaten away at some of the bacteria and killed it. And so penicillin, by accident, was discovered. And it's an amazing story. But the amazingness of the story doesn't end in 1928. It doesn't stop with Dr. Fleming getting a Nobel Prize. I gave Daniel, my little boy, antibiotics this week because of that discovery made 100 years ago. It's very tempting when we read a book like Ruth, that's this beautiful, neat little narrative, to see that story as like this self-contained, neat little wrapped up parcel of God's blessing. And so we read the book of Ruth and we say, God is so good to that family. And we even see the benefits down the line. God is so good immediately to the nation of Israel because through Ruth and saving that family, he's made a way for King David. And so we stuff all of that goodness into the Ruth box in this neat little package and we say, there is God being good. He's doing it and it's all there. But then we come to a text like this and we see the goodness of God in Ruth is actually burst out from the box like tendrils that have spread themselves through the story of God's ongoing goodness to this family and the nation of Israel. God still being good as a consequence of what he did in Ruth to David, to that family, to the nation, now, many, many years later. And so the challenge for us is not to look at God's providences in the past, even the strange ones that seem so specific to that moment, as only having significance and weight for what's already been. You following me? You with me? You understand what I'm saying? That the good God has done in the past doesn't just stay there. It doesn't live in the past and nowhere else. Don't think that God's scale or his scope are so narrow that he used that past experience and trouble maybe that you went through, that circumstance you wish never happened, to do you good then and teach you something, and he's finished with it. He's used that tool for its purpose and shelved it. God doesn't work like that. But he can use what we wish had never happened to us yesterday to continually do us good tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after. That's David's testimony here. Because Naomi left her home because of famine. They were starving. They had no food. They went to Moab. She buried her husband. She buried her 2 sons. One daughter-in-law left her and she returned home with one daughter-in-law. She told everybody she met, call me bitter because God has been so hard on me. And yet God will use that very circumstance to do this family good again and again and again. But friends, I encourage you to maybe consider again, how do you think about the past problems that you've been through? The trials and challenges. We talk about them sometimes, don't we? Like, oh, I went through this and God taught me this, and we think that's it. But God doesn't have to be done. Use it for blessing again and again. Third is divine support. So there's popular support, there's royal support, and then there's divine support. God is helping David, and that's obvious to us through the passage so far. David has found a safe place to live. He's got a group of people with him, so he's no longer struggling to survive by himself. He's also managed to find somewhere for his parents where they're safe and out of Saul's reach. But in verse 5, God's help becomes explicit in that he sends a prophet named Gad with a message for David and his men to leave the cave and head into southern Israel. David does that, and he completes the Robin Hood image, going to live in the forest. Now, we don't know why God sends them there. They seem secure. Everything seems safe. Why go and live back in Israel, away from the safety of the border? Why in the forest, out of the cave that was a fortress? We don't know. But the big thing is not where God says to go, but that God says to go. See, God is speaking to David. And it must never be underestimated how massive a thing that was. A lady named Anne Bodkin was working in her office in central Christchurch when the big earthquake hit. And before she managed to get under her desk, she was hit by part of the ceiling, falling in and knocked to the ground. She crawled underneath her desk just before the rest of the building collapsed, and that's where she was trapped, underneath a big L-shaped desk. She called for help, but there was no answer, and occasionally, 3 times while she was there, the sprinklers would come on and soak everything, soak her clothes, soak the floor, so she was lying in cold water for most of the time that she was there. Before long, she started to hear the sound of equipment and drills as they were digging through the wreckage looking for survivors, but there was no point crying out because nothing was going to be heard over the sound of all of that machinery. She tried to stay awake because she was scared what might happen if she fell asleep so cold. And so she just lay there thinking about better times, holidays, family time. And then 24 hours later, the noise stopped as the rescue crews changed over. And she immediately started shouting, and she heard a reply. Is someone shouting in there? She said, I was hugely relieved. And at that moment, I cried for the first time. She wasn't out of the situation yet, was she? She's still buried under a building. But she knew that she'd been heard. Someone had spoken to her, and that made all the difference. They knew where she was, and now she knew, she was certain that they were working to get her out. David knew some incredible blessings while he was on the run. Remember when he went to Nob and he met the priest there, he was fed and he was armed. Then he was rescued from Gath. Then he found a home in the cave of Adullam. He's got supporters. He's got a place for his family. All of these things are evidences of God's concern and care. But then God speaks. When God sends his word, it's the ultimate proof that God knows exactly where David is. God has heard his cries for help. God cares about his situation and is working for David's rescue. I wonder if you know something of the relief that comes when you're aware of God speaking to you. Anne Bodkin said that when she heard that voice outside, she was hugely relieved. And I read that and I was like, oh, it's a bit disappointing. I wanted to use this for a sermon illustration. I wanted fireworks. I wanted her to say, I heard the voice and my heart leapt for joy. She sounds very English. I was hugely relieved. There's nothing wrong with that response, though, is there? It's the right one. Relief is a picture of a weight being taken away. Unburdened. That's undoubtedly how David would have felt too. The prophet Gad appears, and God is speaking to him. God speaking. It's relief. Have you felt that? Maybe you've been seeking the Lord in something and you've been pleading for his help. You've been asking for rescue from some situation. Or for guidance because you've got a problem at home or at work and you've got no idea which way to go. There's somebody that you love in your family who's got no interest in the Lord. And you want to be a witness to them. But you don't know how to do it without jeopardizing the relationship. And you've prayed and you've prayed and you've sought the Lord, but it feels like heaven is silent. And you know God's there because you can see the evidence of his faithfulness all around you. Other Christians point it out to you whenever you express that kind of distance that you're feeling. And they'll tell you, well, look how God's been good to you. You see how God's preserved you until now. You recognize the times that things could have got worse and they didn't. You recognize you've got breath in your lungs, that's God's grace. You've got food on your table, a roof over your head, there's money in the bank. They're all little confirmations that God hasn't finished with you, that he's still supplying your needs, but you still feel trapped and crushed, cold and wet, hiding under a desk. And then God spoke. And it might have been as you read your Bible. It might have been as you listened to the sermon. It might have been the kids' talk or something that somebody said to you after the service. But you feel like the Lord took those words and he said something just to you. And you feel it is a huge relief. Because even though you're still in the rubble, even though you're not out of the situation yet, you're reminded the Lord knows exactly where I am. And not only is he not giving up on me, but he is at work for my rescue. Friends, if you're in need of hearing God speak, maybe you read a passage like this and you're jealous of David. You see God sending his word to him, his messenger. You remember how God speaks. Because David would swap places with you in a heartbeat. And not because your circumstances aren't as bad as his. He would swap with you because your privileges are far greater. See, David's only way to hear from God is if God sent him a prophet. God has done something so much more wonderful for you. Hebrews 1:1-2. Long ago. Many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God hasn't sent just any messenger to us, he sent us the best. He sent his Son, Jesus, to be his final word to our world. And Jesus deprives every Christian then of any reason that we have for doubting that God is willing to speak to us, because he died for you. And he did it while you were his enemy. Do you think that having saved you and having been sanctifying you for all these years, that Jesus cares less about you now? The one whose word has power to transform things for you is the one who loves you better than anyone ever has or ever will. And his word really does change things. Maybe you're in a situation where you think words are the last thing I need. I need something practical. I need someone to really help, to get alongside. Words are the last thing I want. I'm stuck in the cage of depression. How are words going to help? My marriage is on the rocks. How are words going to help? I'm trapped in that unbreakable cycle of sin and guilt. It's going to take more than words to change things for me. How could words, even words from Jesus, make a difference? Because Jesus' words come with all of Jesus' power. Just think about it. What did he say to a man born deaf and mute? Be opened. 2 words. Be opened. Or to a disabled man who couldn't walk? Get up. Pick up your mat. Walk. Changes everything for him. Words from Jesus. Lazarus, come out. To Jairus' daughter, little girl, wake up. And in those words is the power to resurrect. How about when Jesus said to nothing, let there be light? And everything else in creation and the universe responds by springing into life. Power in the words of Jesus. Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Reach out your hand. Put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. We don't read anywhere in Scripture that Thomas did it. We just read his reply. My Lord, my God. Words from Jesus. And all of his doubt and uncertainty is answered. And every single Christian sitting in this room or listening at home tonight, your life is testimony to the power of Jesus' word. Because wasn't it Jesus' word that changed everything for you? Going along in your sin on the broad road to hell, and the only thing that made the difference was the shepherd's voice calling out. Jesus said that, didn't he? My sheep hear my voice, they follow me. Hear my voice. Hear my words. We're going to sing in a moment. I heard the voice of Jesus say, behold, I freely give the living water. Thirsty one, stoop down and drink and live. And this is our testimony. I came to Jesus and I drank of that life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched. My soul revived. And now I live in him. What made the difference? I heard the voice of Jesus say. Friends, if you're in that place that you need help, pray that Jesus would speak to you. Even if it doesn't change the circumstances immediately, it will change your outlook on them entirely. To know that Jesus knows where you are, that he cares for you, and he is at work for your good, his glory in your life, for your rescue. It's nothing sweeter than knowing that. Let's pray.